Surviving a full day in ancient Rome wouldn't just be difficult, it would be impossible. Forget modern comforts. No running water, no internet, no basic human rights. Life in ancient Rome wasn't about convenience, it was about knowing your place and obeying brutal, unforgiving rules. The towering Roman architecture and grand arenas may have been impressive, but life behind those walls was anything but glamorous. Soldiers faced brutal discipline, hygiene was a constant gamble, and punishments were designed to instill fear. Even meals came with disturbing rituals. So today, let's step into a world where survival wasn't guaranteed, where power dictated every aspect of life, and where even the simplest daily routines came with unexpected dangers. Family and patriarchy. To begin with, in our world, parental control often means setting limits on screen time and games. But in ancient Rome, the concept was completely different. The father, or paterfamilias, held absolute power over his household. He wasn't just the head of the family, he was the law itself. If a newborn didn't meet his expectations, or if a family member acted out of line, the father had the legal authority to decide whether that life should continue. Back then, a single harsh decision by the patriarch could mean a life's end. Imagine having to live every hour under the constant shadow of a ruler in your own home, a guardian whose decisions were final, coldly calculated, and sometimes deadly. While our modern society values emotional support and understanding in family settings, the Romans viewed household authority as a position of power that demanded unwavering respect, even if that respect was enforced by fear and brutal discipline. Class divides. Now, as we all know, modern society struggles with inequality too, but we at least have a shared sense of common rights and legal protections for every citizen. In ancient Rome, there was a strange concept called dignitas, a quality that embodied dignity, merit, honor, self-control, and public respect. But here's the twist. Only a true Roman could have it, and it was usually reserved for the wealthy, well-educated elite. The common people, the plebeians often mockingly called the sordid or vulgar plebs by their betters, were seen as inherently unworthy. They were not granted the grace or respect that came with the title of Roman citizen, and thus were excluded from enjoying the status of having dignitas. Can you imagine living in a world where every public glance, every conversation, and every law reinforced the idea that you were not quite as Roman or worthy as your affluent neighbor? In our modern democracy, while socioeconomic differences exist, dignity is not something available only for a selected group or people. Instead, respect and human rights are seen as universal. In Rome, however, social stratification was so severe that the rich looked upon the working classes as less than human. Perils of being an outsider. Also, today's cities are vibrant tapestries of diverse cultures and traditions. Sometimes challenges exist in reconciling differences and overcoming prejudice. But in ancient Rome, racial animosity was a part of everyday life, and it was woven deep into the city's fabric. Rome was a city of immigrants. People from all over the world flocked to the metropolis in hopes of a better life. But the reality was harsh. Those who came to Rome often found themselves living in overcrowded and unsanitary apartment blocks, or worse, under bridges and in refugee camps on public lands. While today we stress the importance of inclusion and celebrate multiculturalism, in Rome, the city's social order was rigid and unforgiving. Immigrants were looked upon with disdain, and even though they brought invaluable skills, they were forced to live in poor conditions. This way, the ruling elite maintained an image of superiority by keeping a strict divide between themselves and the so-called others. Violence. Likewise, in ancient Rome, violence was an everyday affair even among the elite, but it was administered in a controlled way that maintained one's dignitas. Take, for instance, the advice of the father of the imperial physician Galen. He cautioned his friends against punching their servants in the mouth, not because he was concerned about the pain the servant might feel, but because a blow to the mouth could lead to injuries for themselves. Instead, he recommended striking with a stick. Today, physical violence in any domestic setting would instantly be classified as abuse. something everyone is urged to report and prevent. Modern society insists on gentle correction and the protection of individual rights. But in Rome, physical punishment was an everyday tool of control. The notion that a man could inflict pain simply to reassert his power is alien to us. Yet, in a society where every action was measured against the standard of dignitas, even brutality was structured and legalized as part of the social contract. Walking into such an environment, even as an observer, would make you feel like you had stepped into a history book of horrors rather than a civilization that celebrated art and philosophy. Decimation. Next, envision being a soldier in the mighty Roman legions. Today's armed forces operate under finely tuned rules with strict codes of conduct and the understanding that discipline is maintained through methodical, if sometimes strict, measures. In ancient Rome, however, discipline was both horrible and terrifying. The legions were the backbone of Rome's military prowess. They were well-trained and nearly unstoppable in battle, but behind this formidable force lay a darker secret: decimation. Decimation was a punishment so severe that it remains one of history's most gruesome rituals. When a unit of soldiers became rebellious, perhaps due to long campaigns, poor supplies, or even delayed pay, the Roman commander gathered and split them into groups of 10 and forced each group to draw lots. The soldier unlucky enough to draw the shortest straw was then beaten to death by his 9 comrades. And if that wasn't brutal enough, the soldiers who carried out the beating were temporarily expelled from the legion, forced to live off meager rations like barley until they were allowed back. In a present world where modern military justice involves trials, investigations, and structured protocols, the prospect of decimation is almost unimaginable. The sheer terror it could instill in a unit would crush morale and camaraderie. To face a punishment where your life could be snuffed out by a twist of fate under the watchful eyes of your peers would be psychologically devastating. Law enforcement, moreover. Today, we have well-trained police forces whose job is to protect citizens, enforce laws, and ensure that justice is carried out in a fair way. In contrast, ancient Rome had no modern police force in the true sense. Instead, the city relied on a group known as the Vigiles, about 7,000 men who acted as a fire brigade as well as a petty crime control squad. They were responsible for catching thieves, rounding up runaway enslaved people, and even putting out fires that threatened the densely populated urban districts. But what happened when a serious crime like a riot or a public uprising erupted? The Vigiles often needed to call in Roman guards to help restore order, and even then, the response was brutal by modern standards. Law enforcement was less about human rights and more about preserving the social order through force and intimidation. Punishments. In ancient Rome, how you were punished depended entirely on your social status. For a commoner, a minor crime might mean a whipping or a hefty fine, while more serious offenses could result in punishments that today would be deemed cruel and unusual. For instance, some offenders had wooden shoes placed on their feet to make it nearly impossible to flee, while others were forced to carry pieces of wood inscribed with their crimes, branding them with a sign that announced their misdeeds to the world. And for the gravest offenses, such as revolting against the state, the punishments were even more extreme. Offenders were crucified, thrown from cliffs, plunged into rivers, or even buried alive. These methods weren't just about retribution. They were designed to send a public message that breaking the law in ancient Rome would cost you your life in the most brutal way possible. As a modern citizen used to appeals for restorative justice, the stark terror of knowing that a misstep in public life could instantly reduce you to a gruesome spectacle of punishment is unimaginable. Living under such a regime for even 24 hours would force you to reckon with the constant presence of death lurking behind every law and every legal decision. Toilets. Next, our modern lives are filled with conveniences that we often take for granted, like a clean bathroom, private toilets, and hygienic practices. Travel back to ancient Rome, and you'll find that daily bodily functions were filled with danger and discomfort. Only the wealthy could afford their own private toilets. The vast majority of people in a city teeming with millions of inhabitants had to use public toilets. Modern bathrooms are designed to be comfortable, private, and safe. We have running water, sanitation standards, and hygiene products that keep our environments clean. But the people in ancient Rome used the same toilets where the smell was overpowering, and the risk of exposure to deadly gases like hydrogen sulfide and methane was very real. The buildup of these gases in the ancient sewer systems could occasionally lead to flames shooting up unexpectedly from the toilet seats, injuring or even killing those unlucky enough to be nearby. Not to mention the rats that lived in those pipes. They appeared as creatures that might emerge to bite unsuspecting people in very sensitive areas. The shared sponge. And since we have toilet paper and personal hygiene products today, it's hard to imagine a time when the very tools of cleanliness were nearly as dangerous as the diseases they spread. In ancient Rome, people used a tool called the xylospongium, a sponge attached to a stick, rather than toilet paper. There were only a few of these sponges installed in each public toilet, and they were kept in a basin of water that was rarely cleaned. Think about that for a moment. Instead of reaching for a neatly packaged disposable tissue, you are forced to share a so-called cleaning tool with dozens of strangers. Horrible, isn't it? Well, this sponge, used over and over again, was a genuine breeding ground for bacteria, potentially spreading diseases such as typhoid and cholera. In our world, we rely on modern things and strict hygiene standards to keep us clean and safe from infection. But in ancient Rome, the very act of wiping after relieving oneself could leave one vulnerable to a host of illnesses. Urine now, modern habits sometimes include quirky health remedies and beauty treatments, but nothing could prepare you for the Roman obsession with urine. Yes, you heard that right. Urine. In ancient Rome, urine was incredibly valuable. It wasn't just seen as waste. It was collected and put to many uses. The Romans used urine for tanning leather, washing clothes, and even fertilizing their crops. But perhaps the most surprising use was for dental hygiene. Both human and animal urine were used to keep teeth white and clean. In a modern world where toothpaste, mouthwash, and dental care are taken for granted, relying on urine to keep your smile bright would not only be unappealing, it would be nearly impossible to endure. The value of urine in Roman society is further underscored by the fact that the empire even imposed taxes on its trade. People used to pee in pots that were later emptied into large cesspools. Then the collected fluid was sold as an ingredient in various products. Goat dung. Now, if you thought using urine as a form of dental hygiene was wild, wait until you hear about the Roman use of goat dung. The famed Roman naturalist Pliny the Elder wrote about how goat dung, whether fresh or dried, was used as a makeshift patch for wounds in an emergency. But the ingenuity of the Romans didn't stop there. For charioteers, the daring athletes who risked their lives in high-speed races across the Circus Maximus, a special sports drink was prepared. This drink was made from powdered goat dung mixed with vinegar and was believed to give strength to the exhausted racers. Even Emperor Nero, known for his eccentricities, was said to have consumed this potent mixture when he needed a boost before a chariot race. Today, we have energy drinks and performance enhancers refined through science and careful testing. The very idea of ingesting goat dung in any form would be repulsive and dangerous for modern people. But in ancient Rome, these methods were part of everyday life, accepted and even celebrated among those who believed that nature's odd ingredients could provide extraordinary benefits. Banquets and vomiting. Now, let's step into one of the most notorious aspects of Roman life, their legendary banquets. Roman feasts were events of opulence, excess, and unbridled indulgence. Imagine sitting down in a lavish banquet where tables groaned under mountains of exotic foods and fine wines. You might initially be excited at the prospect of such a feast, but this was no ordinary dinner party like modern world. The Romans had a different philosophy when it came to eating. They believed in the art of overindulgence. As the time passed, guests used to eat until they felt completely stuffed, only to initiate a practice that seems almost alien to modern dining etiquette: deliberate vomiting. Unlike today, where you would politely excuse yourself to the restroom if you felt ill, the Romans kept vomit bowls on hand at the dining tables. As described by the philosopher Seneca, partygoers used to regurgitate right there at the table, making space for even more food. And in some instances, the vomiting occurred directly on the floor, with slaves tasked to clean up the mess promptly, while the revelers continued their feast unabated. In a modern context, this chaotic display of overeating and vomiting is hard to imagine. Our dining experiences now are governed by decorum and self-control, even at the grandest of banquets. The idea of having to participate in or even witness a banquet where the act of vomiting is as natural as breathing would be utterly overwhelming to anyone raised in a society that values moderation and hygiene. Medicine. Additionally, in today's world, medicine is developed through rigorous scientific testing. We rely on doctors, pharmacies, and carefully crafted treatments to cure our ailments. But in ancient Rome, the cure for diseases was a bit more unconventional. Roman citizens believed that gladiator blood held special healing properties. After a fight, spectators used to rush to collect the blood of fallen warriors, believing that drinking it could cure the disease. This practice was so widespread that when gladiatorial combat was eventually banned, Romans refused to abandon their strange remedy. So they turned to the blood of decapitated prisoners, keeping the gruesome tradition alive. Some Roman physicians claimed they saw epileptics recover after consuming human blood. The ultimate Roman beauty secret. Similarly, nowadays, people rely on creams, serums, and beauty treatments to keep their skin fresh and glowing. However, in ancient Rome, skincare took a far more unusual turn. The trendiest beauty product came straight from the sweat of gladiators. Because soap was scarce, Roman athletes cleaned themselves by rubbing their bodies with oil and scraping off the sweat and dead skin cells using a tool called a strigil. Normally, this discarded grime was thrown away. But if you were a victorious gladiator, your sweat was valuable. Romans bottled it up and sold it as an aphrodisiac. Women rubbed gladiator sweat mixed with their scraped skin cells onto their faces, believing it would make them more attractive to men. Unexpected role of penis. Additionally, people today associate good luck with symbols like four-leaf clovers, rabbit's feet, or even lucky numbers. In ancient Rome, however, the preferred charm was far more unexpected. Romans believed that the image of a phallus held protective powers, so it wasn't just something hidden away in private. It was worn proudly as jewelry. Boys often walked the streets with copper penis charms hanging from their necks, believing they would ward off harm. But this tradition wasn't limited to fashion. Romans also painted phallic symbols on treacherous roads, sharp turns, and unstable bridges to bring good luck to travelers. If modern road signs warn about slippery surfaces or dangerous curves, Roman streets relied on lucky phallus drawings to serve the same purpose. Togas nowadays, clothes reflect personal style, whether it's a hoodie, a suit, or a casual t-shirt. But in ancient Rome, clothing was more than just fabric. It was a clear marker of status, citizenship, and respect. Most important dress was toga. Toga was the defining garment of Roman society. Reserved only for citizens, it was an 18-foot-long piece of fabric that had to be carefully wrapped and folded. No buttons, no belts, just layers of cloth strategically draped to stay in place. Wearing a toga wasn't about comfort, it was about sending a message. A plain white toga was worn by regular citizens, while high-ranking officials added a purple stripe to signify their importance. The emperor's toga, however, was entirely purple, a bold statement of absolute power. So, our modern world, with its imperfections and challenges, offers us facilities that ancient societies could only dream of. The systems in place may sometimes fall short of perfection, but they reflect an ongoing commitment to human dignity and the value of every life, a commitment that would be utterly alien in the harsh, unforgiving streets of Rome. The daily realities faced by an average Roman would break the spirit and the body of any modern person within hours, making it impossible to survive even a single day. So what are your thoughts about ancient Roman life? Share with us the comments section below. Also, don't forget to like the video and subscribe to our channel for more interesting content.